She thought she was just escaping grief alone in a remote cabin with nothing but silence and snow. But when an injured dog appeared at her door, half dead and covered in blood, everything changed. Following that injured dog into the forest led her to a chained cabin, and what she found inside would uncover a decades-old secret and a woman running out of time. This isn't just a rescue story. It's about loyalty, survival, and second chances. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment to tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. The silence in the woods of northern Vermont was not just quiet. It was sacred. You could hear your own heartbeat if you stood still long enough. For Marina, that quiet was all she had left. At 42, she carried a weariness far older than her years. Once a thriving trauma nurse in Chicago, she had seen more suffering than most could fathom. The final straw was losing her younger sister to a hit and run, the kind of tragedy that shatters the soul in slow motion. So, she fled. Left the hospital, the city, the life that no longer made sense. Her uncle's cabin hidden deep in a forgotten forest near the Canadian border became her place to disappear. The kind of place with no cell reception, no neighbors, just endless trees and the occasional cry of an owl in the dark. The cabin itself was humble. Built from thick cedar logs, its roof bowed slightly under decades of snow. Wrapped in a wool coat too big for her frame, Marina moved through the space like a ghost, tending to chores out of habit firewood, canned soup, journal entries she never read again. What she didn't know, what no one could have known, was that something was making its way to her through the snow. And it was dying. The storm came fast. 1 minute. The snow was a quiet whisper drifting through the trees. The next, it was a howling, furious wall of white, slamming against the cabin like an angry sea. Marina had been chopping firewood when the first gust hit, sending her stumbling backward, coat flapping, breath torn from her lungs. She bolted inside, slammed the heavy door shut, and dropped the latch into place. The fireplace crackled with life. She threw 2 more logs onto the flames, watching as the light danced across the cabin walls. Her fingers ached with cold even inside her wool gloves, and her face still burned from the wind's sting. She made tea, hands trembling slightly, and curled into the old armchair by the hearth, one of the few things left from her uncle's days. She didn't expect the scratching. At first, it was soft, barely audible over the groaning storm outside. Just a scrape, like a tree branch swaying too close. Then came the whine. Low. Desperate. Marina froze. She turned off the kettle, heart pounding. The sound came again. Scratch! Scratch! A soft, pleading whimper that pierced straight through the wind and her chest. Something was out there. Every instinct in her body screamed, "Don't open that door!" But another voice. Quieter. More human, whispered. What if it needs help? She grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace and crept toward the door. The scratching had stopped, but the whine returned barely a breath now. A final plea. With one hand, she unlatched the door. The wind slammed it open an inch. She leaned her body into it and pried it wider, just enough to see. And there, collapsed in a heap of snow and blood, was a dog. Not just any dog, a German shepherd. Massive and regal even in its near-death state. Its coat, a once lustrous mix of gray and black, was caked with frost and dirt. Blood matted the fur along its flank. It didn't move, save for the soft rise and fall of its chest. Marina's breath caught in her throat. She dropped the poker and fell to her knees. "Oh God," she whispered. She reached forward with trembling hands, feeling for a pulse. Warmth. Anything. The dog's eyes fluttered open, just for a moment, amber and glassy with pain. And then they closed again. "Hang on, buddy. Please hang on." She wrapped her arms around his thick body and dragged him inside, kicking the door shut behind her. The dog was heavier than she expected, dead weight from exhaustion and trauma. She laid him gently on the bearskin rug in front of the fire. Years of medical training clicked into place. She moved automatically, stripping off her wet coat, rushing for the first aid kit buried deep in her duffel bag. The cabin's dim light cast flickering shadows, but she worked with the precision of someone who had once saved lives for a living. A deep gash ran down the dog's side, jagged and dark. She cleaned it with iodine, wincing as he flinched. He didn't cry out. She stitched the wound with trembling fingers, whispering softly, "You're okay now. You're safe." Another cut along his front leg, bruising along the ribs. God, had he been attacked? Bitten hit by something she couldn't tell. But what chilled her more than the wounds was something she nearly missed. Under the thick fur of his front legs, just above the paws, were raw, circular marks like something had been tied around him. Tight. Too tight. Rope burns. Her hands paused. The room grew still, save for the crackle of the fire. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this. Someone had tied this animal down, and somehow he had escaped. Marina sat back, swallowing hard. The dog lay still, his breathing labored but steady. One of his paws twitched as if dreaming or remembering. She reached out and gently stroked his head. "You're not just any stray, are you?" she murmured. The dog's ear flicked. His eyes opened slowly and locked onto hers. There was something ancient and knowing in them. And for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Marina didn't feel alone. By the second night, the storm had moved on, leaving behind a world encased in silence and snow. The sky above was the color of pewter, with stars beginning to wink through the clouds like cautious eyes. Inside the cabin, Marina kept the fire alive through the long hours, occasionally glancing toward the dog, who now rested with his head on his paws, eyes half open. He was healing. Slowly. She had managed to get some broth down his throat, and he drank water when coaxed. The worst of his wounds were cleaned and dressed, and he hadn't shown any signs of infection. But there was something else, something in his stillness, his constant watching of the door as though he were listening for something. It was just past midnight when the change happened. The dog, who had barely moved in hours, suddenly stood. His body went rigid, his ears perked forward, tail stiff, eyes locked on the frost-covered window that looked out into the trees. Marina sat up from her blanket nest by the fire, startled. "What is it?" she asked. The dog didn't flinch. He let out a low, guttural sound, not a growl of aggression, but one of urgency. He walked to the door, then back to her, then again to the door, back and forth. Then came the whine, soft at first, then louder, desperate, commanding. You want to go out?" she asked, unsure. He didn't answer, of course, but his eyes said it all. Something out there was pulling at him. Against every logical thought, every fear that still lingered in the corners of her mind. Marina stood and grabbed her coat. She bundled up quickly, shoved a flashlight into one pocket, and reached for the old hunting knife that her uncle had left hanging by the fireplace, just in case. The dog, she hadn't named him, but he seemed more and more like someone was already pawing gently at the door. "All right," she whispered. "Lead the way." The cold hit like a slap when she opened the door, slicing through her coat and scarf. The snow crunched under her boots as she stepped out, the dog already trotting ahead into the trees, his gait limping but sure. She followed. Through the snow-laden forest, under a sky so full of stars it felt like a storybook. The dog moved with purpose, every few feet. He would pause, glance back to be sure she was still with him, and continue. They walked for maybe 20 minutes, maybe more. Time had no shape out there in the frozen dark. Then, just as she was about to call out, to ask where they were going, the dog stopped. He stood at the edge of a small clearing. Marina caught up to him, panting slightly, and then saw it barely a shadow against the line of trees. A cabin, smaller than hers, older. The roof sagged inward, and one window had been boarded up with mismatched planks of wood. But there was smoke rising from a stone chimney, thin, weak, but real. Someone was inside. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The dog stood perfectly still, then took a single step forward and growled, low and dangerous. His eyes never left the door. That's when Marina noticed it. The front door was chained shut. No tracks, no signs of life, only a lock. She took one cautious step forward, boots sinking into the snow. Her breath clouded the air. The dog let out another sound, half growl, half whine. He was trembling now, not with fear, but with urgency. Something or someone was in that cabin, and they weren't there by choice. "Is this why you came to me?" Marina whispered. "You wanted help. For them." The dog barked once sharp, decisive, then looked straight at her. She didn't understand how. But in that moment, she knew this wasn't just about survival. This was a rescue mission. Marina didn't breathe. Not at first. She just stared at that rusted chain wrapped tightly across the door handles of the old cabin, the padlock glinting in the moonlight like some cruel symbol of forgotten pain. The dog stood beside her, his entire body tense, his ears locked forward, a low rumble vibrating in his throat. There was no mistaking it now. Someone had been locked inside. And the dog had come for them. She felt her mind scrambling for logic. Who would do this? Why would they chain a door shut from the outside? And how the hell had this dog known where to go? How had he known to find her? The animal shifted again, this time pressing his body against the door, letting out a sharp, high-pitched whine. His paw scratched once, twice, and then he looked at Marina, as if to say, "Do something." She stepped forward, heart racing, flashlight in one hand and the hunting knife in the other. The snow crunched beneath her boots like cracking bones in the stillness. She tested the door gently. It didn't budge. The chain was thick, but the lock was old. She had nothing to cut it with, no keys, no tools, and yet, the axe. Marina turned on her heel and sprinted back into the woods, the dog barking once as if in approval. Her breath burned in her lungs as she reached her own cabin. She burst through the door and grabbed the axe from beside the fireplace. Years ago, it had just been another emergency item her uncle insisted on keeping close. Now, it was her lifeline. She returned in minutes, cheeks flushed red with cold and adrenaline. The dog hadn't moved. "Stand back," she murmured. The first strike was awkward. The second sent sparks through the metal. The third finally cracked the rusted lock with a sickening snap. The chain dropped into the snow like a severed snake. Marina reached for the handle and hesitated. Then, bracing herself, she pushed open the door. The inside air was like ice, stale, heavy with something, sweet and rotten. Her flashlight beam cut through the dark, falling on sparse furniture, a half-empty shelf, and a battered wood stove barely giving off any heat. And then she saw her. An elderly woman lay on a cot in the far corner, curled in a fetal position under a thin blanket, her face pale, sunken, and still. Her white hair was matted against her temples. One of her hands dangled limply from the bed, shackled to the frame with a metal cuff. Marina dropped the flashlight. Oh my God. She crossed the room in seconds, heart in her throat. She dropped to her knees and checked for a pulse. They're faint, thready, barely alive. The dog had rushed in after her and was now at the woman's side, licking her hand gently, whining. You knew, Marina whispered, stunned. You knew exactly where she was. The woman stirred just barely. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Marina unclipped her scarf and wrapped it around the woman's neck, trying to create any kind of warmth. Then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small lockpick set her uncle had once taught her to use, more as a joke than a skill. With shaking hands, she worked at the cuff. Click! It popped free. The woman's arm collapsed onto the bed, blood barely circulating. Marina leaned in. You're going to be okay. I've got you now. As she pulled back the blanket to better assess the woman's condition, something hard slipped from under the cot. A worn, leather-bound notebook, edges curled and stained. She picked it up without thinking and opened to the first page. The handwriting was careful, faded. The first entry was dated over a month ago. He said I could leave once I gave him the deed. But I won't. Not after what he's done. Tom, my boy, he tried to protect me. Marina froze. She looked at the dog. Tom, she said aloud. His ears perked up. That was his name. She swallowed hard. The pages that followed detailed something far worse than abandonment. It was imprisonment. Psychological torment. Isolation. Manipulation. The woman, Sarah, according to the journal, had once owned this land, and someone, a relative, had brought her here under false pretenses, then locked her away when she wouldn't sign over a deed. And Tom had been beaten, tied, left for dead, but he hadn't died. He'd crawled through miles of snow, broken and bleeding, with a mission. To find someone, to bring them back. And against all odds, he had found Marina. And she had followed. Tom didn't leave Sarah's side, not even for a second. His body curled protectively against hers on the cot, as if shielding her from the very memory of the man who had done this. Marina worked quickly, tearing apart the small cabin to find anything useful, blankets, kindling, old canned soup, anything to stabilize the woman until she could get her out. But one look at Sarah's sunken cheeks, the brittle yellow hue of her skin, the way her wrists trembled even in sleep, it was clear she wasn't just cold. She was on the edge of something irreversible. They had to leave. Now. But how? The blizzard had broken. Yes, but the snowdrifts were still waist-deep in some places, and the nearest road was miles away. Marina knew there was no way she could carry Sarah alone through that terrain. And Sarah wouldn't survive another night in this place, not with her lungs rasping like torn paper. Marina looked down at Tom. His eyes were wide, alert, as if he was waiting for her to understand something. He stood suddenly and moved to the cabin door, barked once, and looked back. "What are you trying to say?" she whispered. Then it hit her. Smoke. The fire she'd built back at her own cabin. The smoke had always climbed high and visible in the sky. If anyone was nearby, they'd see it, and if she built a bigger one. She turned to Sarah. "I'm going to bring help," she said, voice firm despite the tremble. "I'll make someone see us." Marina looked around and found an old tarp under the cot, stiff and brittle but usable. She wrapped Sarah gently, layering every blanket she could find around her frail frame. Tom watched with steady eyes. Then Marina pointed at him. "You stay," she said, voice quivering. "Don't leave her. Not for a second." Tom sat down and placed one paw gently on the edge of the cot, as if he understood every word. And then Marina ran back through the forest, back through the freezing night, the bitter air burning her lungs. She stumbled, fell once, got back up. Her legs screamed, her fingers went numb. But she didn't stop, not until the sight of her cabin rose in the distance like salvation. She crashed inside, gasping. Her knees hit the floor. Then she moved like someone possessed. She pulled apart everything she could find: magazines, rags, leftover jerky bags, and tossed them into the fireplace. She opened the flue, then threw on the last of the firewood, adding dried pine branches and anything else that would make the smoke black and heavy. The fire roared, and the smoke rose. She ran outside and lit an emergency flare her uncle had left them in an old tackle box by the door. The flare hissed, painting the snow with angry red light. She waved it overhead, praying someone, somewhere, would see it. And someone did. Less than an hour later, she heard it, the low rumble of snowmobiles slicing through the forest. 2 figures emerged, forest rangers, bundled and wide-eyed. When she pointed, breathless and near collapse, back toward the other cabin, they didn't even ask questions. One radioed for medical evacuation. The other helped her back through the trees. And Tom, when they arrived, he was still right there, standing over Sarah like a sentinel. When the paramedics entered and knelt beside her, he didn't move, just watched with deep, unblinking eyes. "She's stable," one of them said after checking her vitals, "but barely. Another few hours," and they didn't finish the sentence. They wrapped Sarah in a thermal cocoon, gave her oxygen, started fluids. As the snowmobiles roared to life, Marina turned back once more and looked at the dog. "You did this," she said softly. Tom didn't wag his tail. He just pressed his head gently into her leg and closed his eyes. The hospital in Montpellier was small, quiet, and understaffed, the kind of place where time slowed down and nurses knew every patient by name. Sarah had been admitted in critical condition, severe dehydration, pneumonia, and malnutrition. But she was alive, and she was stable. Marina stayed. She could have left once Sarah was under care, gone back to the cabin, back to the quiet. But something had shifted the night she followed Tom into that frozen clearing. She didn't want the quiet anymore. She didn't want to be alone. Every day she drove the winding, icy roads into town, Tom in the passenger seat, silent and watchful. They became a familiar pair in the hospital lobby, him lying at her feet, while she sat with a book she never really read. What mattered was presence, that someone was there. Sarah spoke little the first week. Her voice was barely audible, but her eyes tracked Marina wherever she moved. It wasn't until the 3rd day that she whispered the first question. "Your name?" "Marina," she said, gently holding the woman's hand. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You followed him." Marina glanced at Tom, curled up near the foot of the bed. "I did. I think he chose me." Sarah smiled faintly. He always had a good sense for people. Bit by bit, the wall between them melted. Sarah began to tell stories about her childhood, the land, the man she once loved but lost. There was pain in her voice, yes, but also strength, resilience. She wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor. And somewhere in those quiet hospital nights, Marina realized so was she. She'd been surviving for years, numb and mechanical, going through the motions of life after her sister died. But until now, she hadn't been living. Something about Sarah's defiance, even in the face of unthinkable cruelty, sparked a change in her. Marina found herself talking again, not just about the dog or the rescue, but about her own pain. About nights spent crying in bathroom stalls after shifts at the ER. About the guilt that never let her sleep. Sarah listened, and when Marina faltered, Tom would nudge her hand, a gentle reminder that she wasn't alone. One morning, as the sun lit up the snow-covered rooftops outside, Marina wheeled Sarah to a window in the hospital's common room. They watched the light pour through the frost, warming the old woman's face. "I don't think he meant to save just me," Sarah said, her voice steadier now. "I think he meant to save you too." Marina blinked hard, her throat tightening. Maybe he did." When the doctors finally said Sarah was strong enough to be discharged, she had nowhere to go. Her cabin, the place where she'd been held prisoner, was condemned. She had no family left, no home, no possessions. "You'll come with me," Marina said, without hesitation. "Back to the cabin. My cabin. Until you decide where you want to go." Sarah gripped her hand with surprising strength. "You sure, dear?" "I've never been more sure of anything." They returned together. Just the three of them. Bundled in blankets and coats, the truck packed with firewood, groceries, and every comfort Marina could carry. And as they crested the final hill, the cabin came into view, standing proud against the backdrop of the mountains, smoke curling from the chimney. Home. Marina helped Sarah inside and settled her on the couch with pillows and tea. Tom paced the floor for a moment, then curled up by the hearth like he had always belonged there. Because he had. That night, Marina sat by the fire, a worn quilt over her legs, Sarah dozing nearby, and Tom's breathing a soft rhythm in the quiet. She watched the flames dance and thought of how much had changed. She'd come to the woods to disappear, but instead, she'd been found. Spring came slowly to the mountains, like a memory returning after a long, bitter absence. Snowmelt trickled through the moss-covered rocks behind the cabin, and the pines swayed with softer winds. The sharp, punishing silence of winter gave way to bird song, to thawing earth, to something Marina had nearly forgotten how to feel hope. Sarah now walked with a cane, but walked nonetheless. Her steps were measured, her body fragile, but her voice had grown stronger, warmer. And every morning, she stood on the porch with Marina, cradling a mug of tea and staring out at the trees with eyes that had once been filled with fear. But now, only peace. Tom had his own rhythm. He patrolled the cabin grounds like a quiet guardian, alert but calm. His injuries now completely healed. Occasionally he'd disappear into the woods for an hour or two, only to return as if nothing had happened, his tail swaying gently behind him. Marina often wondered if he was just making sure no one else was out there, trapped and waiting, like Sarah had been. Their days settled into a pattern that was both ordinary and extraordinary. They cooked simple meals, played old jazz records Marina found in a box in the attic, and spent long afternoons reading by the fire. But there was one thing neither of them could ignore. The land! The cabin sat on acres of undeveloped forest, its title buried deep in the document Sarah had refused to surrender, papers she had risked everything to protect. When she showed them to Marina, her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the creased deed. There were surveys. Sarah said one evening, her voice quiet. Years ago, someone discovered mineral deposits beneath this land. That's what Dylan wanted. That's what he was willing to chain me up for. Marina felt her stomach twist at the memory of the cabin, the chain, the darkness, the rot. "Are they still worth something?" she asked. Sarah nodded. "More than enough. The company still wants the rights. They've been waiting, watching, assuming I was gone?" They sat in silence for a long moment. The fire crackled. Tom lifted his head and looked at them both, as if sensing something important was being decided. Marina finally spoke. "Then let's use it. Not for greed, not for revenge, but for good." Sarah's eyes shimmered. "What did you have in mind?" The idea bloomed slowly, but once spoken aloud, it refused to go away. They reached out to a local lawyer, then to a conservation group, and finally to a mining company that specialized in ethical extraction. Under strict contracts and environmental oversight, they negotiated a limited lease that would fund something neither of them could have imagined just months ago. The Tom Foundation, named for the dog who had done the impossible, a nonprofit dedicated to two causes supporting trauma recovery for veterans and rescuing abused animals. "Two kinds of soldiers," Sarah said with a smile, brushing her hand over Tom's thick fur. "Those with scars you can see, and those with ones you can't." Word spread quickly through the small Vermont communities. Stories were written, donations came in, volunteers showed up. But none of it changed the heart of the story. That 3 souls, one broken by war, one nearly broken by betrayal, and one who refused to let either of them be forgotten, had found each other in the frozen silence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge and cast a golden hue over the trees, Marina sat beside Sarah on the front porch. Tom lay at their feet, tail brushing against Marina's boot. "You ever think," Sarah said softly, "how strange it is that the very thing that brought us the most pain led us here?" Marina looked out at the land, the cabin, the trail Tom had once carved through the snow. "I don't think it's strange," she whispered. "I think it was grace." Sarah smiled. "He saved me." Marina reached down and scratched behind Tom's ears. "He saved both of us. Sometimes, the ones who save us aren't the ones we expect." Marina thought she had escaped to the mountains to heal from loss, but in truth, she was only hiding. It wasn't until an injured dog appeared at her doorstep, dragging with him the weight of another person's suffering, that she remembered who she was: a healer, a protector, someone who still had more to give. Tom wasn't just a dog, he was a messenger. His loyalty, even in pain, reminded her that love doesn't end with loss, that when we step outside of our own grief to help someone else, we often begin to heal ourselves. And Sarah's survival wasn't just about being found, it was about being believed, about someone showing up when no one else did. In a world that often feels cold and indifferent, sometimes all it takes to change everything is to follow a cry for help. If this story moved you, subscribe for more, and if you believe in second chances, share it. Sometimes, it's the quietest cries for help that lead us home.